The small town of Millbrook, Georgia, had always moved at its own slow pace. Life in 1979 was simple for most, but for 19-year-old James Miller, everything was about to change on a hot summer afternoon that would alter the course of his life forever. James worked two jobs to help support his widowed mother and younger sister. During the day, he cleaned at the local high school, and in the evenings, he worked at Johnson's Auto Repair. He was known around town as a quiet, hard-working young man who always had a gentle smile for everyone he met. Sarah Henderson owned the most popular general store in town, a business her family had run for 3 generations. At 45, she commanded respect among the white townspeople and was known for her sharp tongue and strict rules about how black customers should behave in her store. She made them wait until all white customers were served and often accused them of stealing. On July 15, 1979, James stopped by Henderson's store to buy medicine for his mother, who was suffering from a bad cold. The store was unusually empty that afternoon, with only Mrs. Henderson behind the counter, counting the day's earnings. As James walked toward the medicine aisle, the bell above the door chimed again. Through the store's security mirror, he saw a man in a baseball cap enter quickly, but James paid little attention and focused on finding the right medicine. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. By the time James rushed to the front, the man in the cap was gone, and Mrs. Henderson was on the floor, her cash register open and empty. When she saw James, her eyes widened with what seemed like recognition, but something was off in her expression. 2 police cars arrived within minutes, their sirens breaking the usual quiet of Millbrook's main street. Officer Thompson and Officer Baker burst in with their hands on their weapons. Mrs. Henderson pointed directly at James, her fingers shaking. "He did it. He attacked me and stole all the money." James felt his world spinning. "No, ma'am, I didn't. I just came for medicine. There was another man." "Shut up, boy," Officer Thompson barked, roughly handcuffing James despite his protests. The cold metal bit into his wrists as he tried to explain that he was innocent. Mrs. Henderson's boyfriend, Tom Whitaker, arrived at the store just as James was being pushed into the police car. He comforted her as she gave her statement, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Nobody noticed the baseball cap stuffed hastily into his back pocket, or the nervous way he kept glancing at James. News spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By nightfall, everyone had heard that James Miller had attacked Sarah Henderson and robbed her store. The local paper's evening edition already had the story on its front page, with James' old-school photo prominently displayed. In the county jail, James sat on a hard metal bed, his head in his hands. His mother and sister came to visit, both crying. "I was at the store for Mama's medicine," he told them through the visiting room glass. "I saw someone else come in. He was wearing a cap." "We believe you, James," his mother said, pressing her hand against the glass. "We'll fight this. We'll find a lawyer." But finding a lawyer willing to defend a young black man against the word of Sarah Henderson proved nearly impossible. The 3 attorneys they approached all declined to take the case. Finally, the court appointed a public defender. Fresh out of law school, David Cohen had never handled a felony case before. When Cohen visited James in jail, he looked uncomfortable and overwhelmed. "Look, James, they're offering a plea deal. 5 years instead of life. Maybe you should consider." "I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do," James insisted, his voice firm despite his fear. "I was there to buy medicine for my mama. Mrs. Henderson is lying, and I think she knows who really did it." As days turned into weeks, James watched through his cell window as summer faded into fall. His mother fell ill from the stress, and his sister had to drop out of school to work full-time. The town had already decided he was guilty, and white residents who had known him his whole life now crossed the street to avoid his family. Sarah Henderson, meanwhile, gave interviews to local newspapers, describing in vivid detail how the brutal attack had traumatized her. She became a symbol of white vulnerability in the South, while James was portrayed as everything the community feared. What no one knew was that every night, she looked at herself in the mirror, practicing the lies she would tell in court, while her boyfriend Tom reminded her what was at stake if the truth ever came out. For James Miller, the nightmare was just beginning, and the walls of justice were closing in around him, built brick by brick with lies and prejudice that would take 44 years to tear down. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood tall and imposing on a crisp October morning in 1979. Inside, the air was thick with tension as James Miller's trial began. The wooden benches were divided like the town itself, white spectators on one side, the small group of black supporters, including James's family, on the other. Judge William Harrison, known for his harsh sentences against black defendants, looked down from his bench with cold eyes. The jury selection had taken less than 2 hours, resulting in 12. Sarah Henderson entered the courtroom like a celebrity, wearing a neck brace she didn't need and leaning on her boyfriend Tom's arm. Several jurors nodded sympathetically as she passed. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment with the district attorney, Robert Fuller, who had never lost a case against a black defendant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Fuller began, his voice smooth as honey, "what happened in Henderson's general store was not just a robbery. It was an attack on our way of life, on the very fabric of our community." He pointed dramatically at James. "This man chose violence and theft over honest work." David Cohen, James's inexperienced public defender, fumbled with his papers and knocked over a water glass during his opening statement. "My client, Mr. Miller, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time," he stuttered, already sounding defeated. James's mother closed her eyes in despair. The prosecution's case moved quickly. Officer Thompson testified about finding James at the scene, conveniently leaving out that he had been calmly looking for medicine. The store's regular customers, all white, spoke about James's suspicious behavior in the weeks before the incident, though none could provide specific examples. Then came Sarah Henderson's moment. She took the stand with tears already forming in her eyes. "I was doing my daily accounting when he came in," she said, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. "I'd always been kind to him, even let him shop in my store. But that day, I saw evil in his eyes." She described an attack that never happened, adding brutal details that made several jurors gasp. "He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the register," she lied, touching the neck brace gently. "He said he'd been waiting to teach me a lesson." During cross-examination, Cohen barely challenged her story. He didn't ask about security cameras that might have captured the real perpetrator. He didn't question why no bruises were documented in her medical exam. He didn't even mention the mysterious man in the baseball cap that James had seen. Tom Whitaker sat in the front row, squeezing Sarah's hand when she returned to her seat. During a court recess, they whispered in a corner, and Sarah wiped away tears that appeared as soon as anyone looked their way. What no one saw was Tom's tight grip on her arm, reminding her to stick to their story. When James took the stand to defend himself, the district attorney attacked him relentlessly. "Why were you really in the store that day, Mr. Miller?" Fuller demanded. "Wasn't it to scope out your target?" "No, sir," James replied steadily. "My mama was sick. I have the prescription note." "A convenient story," Fuller interrupted. "And I suppose you also have an explanation for why Mrs. Henderson, a respected member of our community, would lie about such a serious matter?" Before James could answer, Fuller produced a juvenile record showing James had once been caught stealing candy at age 12. The fact that he'd been hungry and hadn't eaten in 2 days was never mentioned. The jury saw only what Fuller wanted them to see: a black teenager with a record facing a respected white businesswoman. The deliberation lasted just 45 minutes. James watched each juror avoid his eyes as they filed back in. His sister gripped their mother's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. The foreman stood, his voice clear and cold. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Judge Harrison didn't wait even a day for sentencing. "James Miller," he intoned, "your vicious attack on Mrs. Henderson shows you are a danger to society. I hereby sentence you to life in prison." As officers led James away, Sarah Henderson dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief, accepting congratulations from townspeople. Tom hurried her out of the courthouse, both of them avoiding the piercing stare of James's mother, who called out after them, "God sees everything." That evening, Sarah sat at her vanity, removing the neck brace and staring at her unmarked throat in the mirror. Tom came up behind her, kissing her neck. "You get good, baby? Nobody will ever know the truth." But in his cell at the county jail, James Miller made a promise to himself as he waited for transfer to state prison. "The truth always comes out," he whispered into the darkness. "Even if it takes a lifetime, the truth always finds its way to light." Life in Georgia State Penitentiary moved in its own strange rhythm for James Miller. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and months into decades. The young man who entered prison at 19 watched through barred windows as seasons changed 44 times, marking the slow passage of time like notches on his cell wall. During his first year, James would wake up gasping, believing he was back in his childhood bedroom. James took those words to heart. While other inmates spent their time in the yard playing cards or getting into trouble, he began visiting the prison library. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Watson, noticed his hunger for knowledge and started bringing him extra books. Under her guidance, James earned his GED in 1982, followed by a correspondence degree in law from behind bars. But life outside prison walls didn't wait for James. In 1985, his mother's health began failing. Her weekly visits became monthly, then stopped altogether. When the prison chaplain called James to his office one rainy morning in 1986, James already knew. His mother had passed away without seeing her son as a free man. That night, alone in his cell, James allowed himself to cry for the first time since his conviction. His sister Lisa tried to maintain contact, but raising 3 kids alone made regular visits difficult. She sent photos of his nieces and nephews growing up, their smiling faces a bitter reminder of all he was missing. The hardest blow came when she told him about his daughter, Tamika, born 3 months after his arrest. The mother had moved away, married another man, and never told Tamika about her real father. Meanwhile, Sarah Henderson's life flourished. Through the prison grapevine, James heard she had expanded her store into a successful chain across 3 counties. Her relationship with Tom Whitaker had ended mysteriously in 1983, but she remarried a wealthy businessman. She became a prominent figure in local politics, often speaking about crime prevention and her traumatic experience. Inside prison, James gained respect for his calm demeanor and wisdom. Younger inmates came to him for advice, and even the guards treated him differently. He started a literacy program for fellow inmates, teaching them to read and write. The warden noted his exceptional behavior, but appeals for early release were consistently denied. In 1999, James witnessed the arrival of the first computers in the prison library. Mrs. Watson, now using a walker but still sharp as ever, taught him how to use them. James discovered a world of information about wrongful convictions and DNA evidence. He began writing letters to every Innocence Project and legal aid organization he could find. Most letters went unanswered. Those that did respond said the same thing. Without new evidence or DNA to test, they couldn't help. Every rejection felt like being sentenced all over again, but James kept writing. He filled dozens of notebooks with research and legal arguments, mailing copies to anyone who might listen. The hardest moments were when other inmates were released. James would help them prepare, give advice about the changed world they'd find outside, and watch them walk to freedom while he remained behind. Some would promise to help clear his name, but life on the outside usually overwhelmed them, and their promises faded like old photographs. By 2010, James had spent more time inside prison than out. His hair had turned gray, and reading required glasses, but his mind remained sharp. He worked in the prison library, now computerized, helping other inmates with legal research. Young guards sometimes mistook him for a volunteer counselor rather than an inmate. Lisa's visits became rare, though she never missed sending a birthday card. Her children, now adults themselves, wrote occasionally, knowing their uncle only through their mother's stories. Tamika, his unknown daughter, had graduated college and become a lawyer, unknowingly following her father's passion for justice. In his cell at night, James would look at the moon through his narrow window and think about Sarah Henderson, not with hatred, but with curiosity about what had driven her to destroy his life. He'd heard rumors that guilt had started eating at her, that she'd become increasingly paranoid about her lies being discovered. Then, in late 2020, a young lawyer from the Innocence Project finally answered one of his letters. Her name was Michelle Chen, and she saw something in his case that others had missed. Mr. Miller, her letter read, "I believe you were wrongfully convicted, and I want to help prove it." For the first time in decades, James felt something dangerous start to grow in his heart: hope. But he learned that hope, like freedom, could be a double-edged sword. Still, as he wrote back to Ms. Chen, his hand was steady. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally come to light. Michelle Chen's arrival at Georgia State Penitentiary in early 2021 marked the beginning of change in James Miller's case. The young lawyer brought fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques to a case that had gathered dust for over 4 decades. She spent hours in the prison library with James, going through every detail of that fateful day in 1979. Something doesn't add up about Sarah Henderson's testimony, Michelle said one day, spreading old court documents across the table. Her medical records from 1979 show no signs of the brutal attack she described. And why wasn't the man I? What Michelle didn't know was that across town, Sarah Henderson was fighting her own battles. Now in her late 80s, she had moved into the prestigious Pine Grove nursing home. The weight of her lies had taken a physical toll. Her hair had turned completely white, her hands shook constantly, and she barely slept. Sarah's new nurse, Angela Williams, noticed her patients' troubled nights. She would wake up screaming, calling out, "I'm sorry, James," and Tom made me do it. At first, Angela dismissed it as confusion from an aging mind, but the specific details kept repeating. One stormy night in March 2022, Sarah's health took a sudden turn for the worse. As lightning flashed outside her window, she grabbed Angela's hand with surprising strength. "I need to confess," she whispered. "I can't die with this sin." Angela, thinking quickly, pressed the record button on her phone as Sarah began to speak. The old woman's voice was weak, but clear as she detailed the truth about that day in 1979. Tom Whitaker, her boyfriend at the time, had planned the robbery to pay off gambling debts. He had threatened to expose her own illegal activities if she didn't help frame someone else. "We chose James because he was there buying medicine," Sarah's voice cracked on the recording. "Tom said no one would believe a black boy over me. He wore the baseball cap. He's the one who emptied the register. James was innocent. Dear God, he was completely innocent." The recording continued for nearly an hour as Sarah revealed every detail, how Tom had coached her testimony, how they had fabricated evidence, and how the local police had helped cover up the truth. She even revealed that Tom had blackmailed several jury members who owed money to his illegal gambling operation. Angela, shocked by the confession, contacted Michelle Chen immediately. Within days, the Innocence Project team was building a new case. They tracked down Tom Whitaker, now living in Florida under an assumed name, and found evidence of his gambling operation from the 1970s. More surprisingly, they discovered that Sarah Henderson had faked her own death shortly after her confession. She had been moved to a private facility in Florida by her children, who feared the legal consequences of her admission. But her recorded confession, combined with the new evidence, was enough to reopen James's case. The district attorney's office, now led by a young progressive lawyer, moved quickly. They found the original case file hidden in the courthouse basement, complete with suppressed evidence that would have proved James's innocence. Photos of Tom Whitaker's baseball cap, witness statements about seeing him run from the store, and even a handwritten note from Officer Thompson expressing doubts about James's guilt. All had been buried for decades. Michelle presented the new evidence to the court in a dramatic hearing. The recording of Sarah's confession played through the courtroom speakers, her frail voice describing how she had knowingly sentenced an innocent young man to lifetime in prison. Several jurors from the original trial, now elderly themselves, came forward to admit they had been pressured to convict. The current judge, unlike his predecessor, listened carefully to all the evidence. "This case," he declared, "represents a grave miscarriage of justice. The conviction of James Miller is hereby overturned." News of James' exoneration spread quickly through the prison. Inmates cheered, guards shook his hand, and Mrs. Watson, now retired but present for the occasion, hugged him with tears in her eyes. But James' own reaction was surprisingly quiet. He sat in his cell one last time, looking at the same patch of sky he'd watched for 44 years. The truth really did come out, he whispered to himself, remembering his promise from decades ago. As Michelle prepared his release papers, a reporter asked James how he felt about Sarah Henderson's confession. He thought carefully before answering. "The truth freed 2 people today, her from her guilt, and me from these walls. But this isn't the end of the story." Indeed, it wasn't. Sarah Henderson was still alive, hidden away in Florida. Tom Whitaker was living freely under his new identity, and James Miller had 4 decades of injustice to address. The truth had emerged, but justice was still waiting to be served. On a bright spring morning in 2023, James Miller walked through the prison gates for the first time in 44 years. At age 63, his once black hair was now silver, but his eyes held the same gentle strength they had always possessed. He wore a new suit provided by the Innocence Project, and his sister Lisa waited for him with tears streaming down her face. The media turnout was massive. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions as James took his first steps as a free man. Michelle Chen stood beside him, acting as both lawyer and shield from the overwhelming attention. Local, national, and even international press had gathered to witness his release. "Mr. Miller, how does it feel to be free?" a reporter called out. James paused, looking at the sky without prison bars blocking his view. "Like waking up from a very long nightmare," he replied quietly. "But I'm more interested in what happens next than what happened before." Lisa rushed forward to embrace her brother, her gray hair mixing with his as they held each other. Her children, his nieces and nephews now in their 30s, stood nearby, meeting their uncle properly for the first time. James was surprised to find himself shorter than all of them. "Mama would be so happy," Lisa whispered in his ear. "She never stopped believing in you." The state of Georgia had prepared a substantial settlement for James, $2.5 million for each year of wrongful imprisonment, totaling $110 million. It was one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in American history. The governor himself made a public apology, calling James's case a stain on our state's conscience. But freedom came with its own challenges. The world had changed dramatically since 1979. Lisa took James to her home, where he encountered his first smartphone, struggled with the TV remote, and marveled at the internet. Everything from cars to coffee makers seemed to require new learning. "You can talk to this thing?" he asked in amazement, watching Lisa use voice commands with her phone. "And it answers back?" The hardest moment came when Lisa showed him a photo of his daughter Tamika. Now 43, she was a successful civil rights attorney in Atlanta, never knowing her father's story. James spent hours staring at her picture, seeing his mother's smile in her face. "Should we tell her?" Lisa asked gently. James shook his head. "Not yet, she has her own life. I don't want to disrupt it until I figure out my own." The adjustment period was both wonderful and difficult. James would wake up at 5 a.m., still on prison time, and forget he could walk outside whenever he wanted. He jumped at loud noises and found crowds overwhelming. The Innocence Project provided counseling to help him cope with post-incarceration trauma. His story sparked national outrage and renewed conversations about racial justice in America. Civil rights organizations invited him to speak, and universities requested lectures. James agreed to some appearances but focused primarily on rebuilding his life. He opened his first bank account, got a driver's license, and bought a small house near Lisa's. The local library offered him a job in their legal research department, recognizing his skills developed over decades of prison study. Slowly, he began creating a new normal. One morning, while reading the newspaper, a habit he refused to give up for digital news, James saw something that made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his mouth. It was a small article about a luxury nursing home in Florida being investigated for helping wealthy clients fake their deaths to avoid legal consequences. The facility's name matched the one mentioned in Michelle's investigation of Sarah Henderson's disappearance. James called his lawyer immediately. "We found her, James," Michelle confirmed after making some calls. "Sarah Henderson is very much alive, living under the name Sarah Mitchell in Tampa, and there's more. Tom Whitaker is in the same city, running a real estate business." James sat silently for a long moment, processing this information. All these years, he had imagined Sarah Henderson living with the guilt of her lies, perhaps finding redemption in her confession. Instead, she had orchestrated one final deception. "What do you want to do?" Michelle asked carefully. James looked around his new home, at the photos of his family, at the life he was finally building. He thought about his mother, who died waiting for justice, and about his daughter, who grew up without a father because of one woman's lies. "I want justice," he said firmly. "Not revenge, but real justice. And I want the whole truth to come out, not just for me, but for every innocent person still behind those walls." The next chapter of James Miller's story was about to begin, and this time he would write it as a free man. The Sunshine Villa retirement community in Tampa, Florida, was everything its name suggested: luxurious, peaceful, and very expensive. Sarah Henderson, now living as Sarah Mitchell, spent her days in a private suite overlooking manicured gardens, believing she had successfully escaped her past. On a warm afternoon in June 2023, Sarah sat on her balcony, sipping iced tea and reading a mystery novel. At 89, she had aged gracefully thanks to expensive care and a life free from prison bars. Her white hair was perfectly styled, her clothes designer-made, and her wrinkled hands adorned with expensive rings. What Sarah didn't know was that she was being watched. From a parked car across the street, James Miller observed the woman who had stolen 44 years of his life. Michelle Chen sat beside him, legal documents spread across her lap. "She looks peaceful," James said quietly. "While I counted days in a cell, she's been living in paradise." The investigation had revealed stunning details. Sarah hadn't just faked her death. She had transferred millions in assets, created a new identity with help from corrupt officials, and even underwent minor plastic surgery to change her appearance slightly. Tom Whitaker had helped arrange everything, using his connections in the criminal underworld. James watched as a familiar figure approached Sarah's balcony. Tom Whitaker himself, now in his 70s but still carrying himself with the same arrogant confidence. He kissed Sarah's cheek and sat down beside her, like a scene from a peaceful retirement commercial. "They're still together," James said, his voice tight with disbelief. "After everything they did." Michelle touched his arm gently. "We have enough evidence to arrest them both. The FBI is ready to move on our signal." But James held up his hand. "Wait, I want to talk to her first." Despite Michelle's protests about legal risks, James stepped out of the car. He straightened his tie. He dressed impeccably now, making up for decades in prison uniforms, and walked toward the retirement community's entrance. The receptionist smiled warmly. "Can I help you?" "Yes," James replied smoothly. "I'm from the state attorney's office. I need to speak with Mrs. Mitchell about an urgent matter." Minutes later, James stood outside Sarah's door. He could hear her laughing at something Tom had said. The sound made his hands shake slightly, but he steadied himself and knocked. Sarah opened the door, her smile freezing as recognition slowly dawned in her eyes. She stumbled backward, knocking over a vase of flowers. Tom jumped up, his face draining of color. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson," James said calmly, stepping into the room. "Or should I say, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah collapsed into a chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. How did you find me?" "The truth has a way of surfacing," James replied, sitting down across from her. "Just like your confession did." Tom moved toward the door, but James' next word stopped him. "The FBI is outside, Mr. Whitaker. Running won't help anymore." The three of them sat in a strange triangle of silence. 44 years of lies, guilt, and injustice hung in the air between them. Sarah began to cry, her expensive makeup running down her wrinkled cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was a coward. Tom said they'd never believe you over me, and I was too afraid to stand up to him. Then one lie led to another, and another." "Sorry doesn't give me back my mother's funeral," James said quietly. "It doesn't give me back my daughter's childhood. It doesn't erase 44 years in a cell." Tom finally spoke, his voice harsh. "What do you want? Money? We can pay." James cut him off with a laugh that held no humor. "I don't want your money. I want justice, real justice, not just for me, but for every innocent person still sitting in prison because of lies like yours." He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. "The FBI will be here in about 10 minutes. I just wanted you to see me, to see that I survived what you did to me, and to let you know that running away to paradise doesn't erase your sins." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, "Wait. Please, can you ever forgive me?" James paused at the door, looking back at the pathetic figure she had become. "Forgiveness is between you and God, Mrs. Henderson. Justice is between you and the state of Georgia. I'm just here to make sure you face it." As he walked out, he heard sirens in the distance. Federal agents would soon swarm the peaceful retirement community, ending Sarah and Tom's decades of freedom bought with his suffering. But James didn't stay to watch. He had his own life to live now, and he'd wasted enough time on them already. The Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed with anticipation as James Miller walked through its doors in September 2023. This time, he wasn't in handcuffs but in an elegant suit, his silver hair neatly trimmed, carrying a briefcase filled with legal documents. The same courthouse that had once condemned him would now witness his greatest triumph. Sarah Henderson and Tom Whitaker sat at the defendant's table, both looking significantly older than their paradise days in Florida. They faced multiple charges: perjury, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against them was overwhelming, thanks to Sarah's recorded confession and the paper trail of their escape to Florida. But James had a different kind of revenge in mind. During the months following their arrest, he had been working quietly with his legal team on something much bigger than their prosecution. As the trial proceeded inside, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse around a podium bearing a sign: the Miller Justice Foundation. The crowd murmured in surprise. The Henderson estate, a symbol of old money and racial inequality in the town, would now serve justice. James had used part of his settlement money to outbid several developers for the property. Inside the mansion's grand entrance hall, where Sarah Henderson had once hosted segregated parties, construction workers were already removing the old fixtures. The space would soon house law offices dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted inmates. The general store, where James's nightmare began, would become a museum documenting cases of wrongful conviction and racial injustice. "This isn't about revenge," James explained to reporters. "It's about transformation. Every person who was wrongly imprisoned deserves a voice, and this center will help them find it." The project attracted national attention. Civil rights organizations pledged support, and law firms offered pro bono services. Even some of the original jurors from James's trial came forward to volunteer, seeking redemption for their part in his wrongful conviction. James hired Lisa's daughter, Angela, a successful architect, to redesign the buildings. She incorporated elements that symbolized both imprisonment and freedom: barred windows that opened into gardens, dark corridors that led to light-filled rooms. The museum would include an exact replica of James's prison cell, helping visitors understand the reality of wrongful incarceration. The most powerful exhibit was the Wall of Years, a massive installation showing 44 photographs of James, one for each year of his imprisonment. Beside each photo were pictures of what he missed that year: his mother's funeral, his daughter's graduations, family weddings, and historical events. Sarah Henderson watched news coverage of the center's development from her jail cell. The sight of her family's legacy being transformed into a monument to justice broke something inside her. She requested a meeting with James. In a small prison meeting room, Sarah, now looking every bit her age without her expensive care, faced James across a metal table. "You've taken everything from my family," she said, her voice bitter. James leaned forward, his expression calm. "No, Mrs. Henderson, I've given everything you took from me a new purpose. Your store, where you accused an innocent man, will now help free other innocent people. Your mansion, built on lies and prejudice, will become a place of truth and justice. That's not revenge, that's redemption." The center opened 6 months later on a bright spring morning. Hundreds attended the ceremony, including several exonerated individuals James had helped while the center was being built. His daughter Tamika, who had finally learned the truth about her father, stood proudly beside him as he cut the ribbon. Inside, the first case files were already being reviewed. The center's legal team, led by Michelle Chen, had identified dozens of potentially wrongful convictions that needed investigation. James spent his days in the library he had created, helping law students research cases and teaching them about the importance of truth and justice. The Henderson family name, once synonymous with power and privilege in the town, now stood for something entirely different. Every morning, people walked past the new sign in front of the historic mansion: the Miller Center for Justice, because the truth cannot be imprisoned. For James, this was the sweetest revenge possible: not destruction, but creation; not punishment, but progress. He had transformed decades of injustice into a force for good, ensuring that his suffering would help prevent others from facing the same fate. And every evening, as he locked up the center that had once been his accuser's home, he smiled at the thought of Sarah Henderson in her cell, watching her lies crumble into something beautiful and just. The winter of 2024 brought dramatic changes to Millbrook, Georgia. The Miller Center for Justice had become a beacon of hope, its lights burning late into the night as lawyers and volunteers worked tirelessly on cases of wrongful conviction. But the biggest change was about to unfold in the same courthouse where James Miller's nightmare had begun 45 years earlier. Sarah Henderson and Tom Whitaker's trial finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom was packed as Judge Maria Rodriguez, the daughter of migrant farm workers who had once worked for the Henderson family, prepared to deliver the verdict. James sat in the front row, surrounded by his family. His daughter Tamika, now a key member of the center's legal team, held his hand. Lisa sat on his other side, her children and grandchildren filling the row behind them. They had all watched the 3-week trial unfold, hearing testimony about decades of deception. Sarah Henderson, now looking every bit of her 89 years without her expensive beauty treatments, shakily stood with her court-appointed lawyer's help. On the charges of perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice, this court finds both defendants guilty on all counts, the judge declared. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Whitaker, your actions stole 44 years from an innocent man's life. That is a debt that can never be repaid." Sarah began to cry, but the judge wasn't finished. "Mrs. Henderson, you are sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mr. Whitaker, given your role as the mastermind and your subsequent crimes, you are sentenced to 25 years. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Many had expected lighter sentences given the defendants' ages, but Judge Rodriguez had sent a clear message. Justice had no expiration date. As the bailiffs led Sarah and Tom away, Sarah turned to look at James one last time. "I truly am sorry," she whispered. James nodded quietly. "I know. And now you truly understand what sorry feels like." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around James and his family. "Mr. Miller, how do you feel about the verdict?" they called out. James stood at the microphone, his silver hair gleaming in the winter sunlight. "Today isn't about revenge," he said clearly. "It's about accountability. No one is above the law, no matter how rich or powerful they might be." The case made national headlines, becoming a symbol of changing times. Other elderly perpetrators of racial injustice began facing consequences for long-buried crimes. The Miller Center received hundreds of new cases to review, and their success rate in overturning wrongful convictions grew impressively. 1 month after the verdict, James received an unexpected letter from Sarah Henderson. She wrote about her first nights in prison, how the concrete walls felt like they were closing in, how the loss of freedom made every minute feel like an hour. "I finally understand what I did to you," she wrote, "and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to make it right." Sarah began working with the Miller Center from prison, providing testimony about other wrongful convictions she knew about from her years in Millbrook's high society. Her information helped overturn 3 more convictions within the first year. Tom Whitaker, however, remained unrepentant. He died 6 months into his sentence, taking many secrets to his grave. But his death led to the discovery of documents in his estate that implicated several former police officers and judges in a conspiracy of wrongful convictions spanning decades. On the first anniversary of the Miller Center's opening, James stood in the museum section, looking at the wall of years. A new panel had been added, showing Sarah Henderson's confession, trial, and conviction. Beside it hung the quote, "Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied." Tamika joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You know, Dad, when I was a little girl, I used to dream about having a superhero for a father. Turns out I did, just not in the way I imagined." James hugged his daughter close, watching his visitors move through the exhibits, learning, understanding, and often crying as they realized the human cost of injustice. The Henderson mansion, once a symbol of oppression, now rang with the sounds of hope and healing. In his office that evening, James added one final entry to his journal. "Today, justice isn't just a word in a law book. It's alive in these halls, in the lives we're changing, in the truth we're uncovering. My 44 years weren't wasted. They were just waiting for this moment, when one man's imprisonment could lead to so many others' freedom. And that's a revenge sweeter than anything I could have imagined." The story of James Miller and Sarah Henderson became required reading in law schools across the country, a testament to the power of truth and the importance of never giving up on justice, no matter how long it takes.